Okay, yes, it's me.
And if you'd like to all mute yourselves.
Yeah.
You.
Yes, everybody mute, please. Yeah, I thought we'd have a little look. We'll start off with just looking at why Israel chose to select a king. It always looks to us as though they did something really wrong, and God said to Samuel that they hadn't rejected Samuel, they'd rejected God, and yet maybe there are some reasons why they thought they should have asked for a king. But anyway, we'll go through it, have a look at it, maybe branch out here and there into a diversion here and there, which is what I always like to do. I will share a screen. Mostly on the screen I've just got text. If you all have your Bible with you and your phone or whatever you like to read your Bible on, we will be having a look partly at 2 Chronicles 18, but for a start we'll just look at some other texts and then we'll come back to 2 Chronicles 18. I'd like to have a bit of a look, if we have time, at Jehoshaphat and what sort of a king he was. I always feel a bit sorry for Jehoshaphat. I always think he was a good guy, but he made some terrible mistakes that just had absolute tragic consequences. So we'll have a look at that as we go. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen. And hopefully, does that sort of come up? Okay, is everybody okay with that? Okay, it's all working. Okay, I've just got to keep moving my tiles. Every time I look, I can't see my screen because the tiles are there. Okay, going to start off with why did the people ask for a king? 1 Samuel 8, we've just come out of the period of the judges. We've come into the period where Samuel unites the people. It's always interesting to me to look at the fact that the people were sort of breaking up into little factionist groups during the period of the judges. When one judge was judging in Dan, another one was judging in Asher, and another one was judging over in Gilead. And they seem to be breaking up into little groups. And I think God really saw that they needed a unifying force. And Samuel was the one to bring them all together. And Samuel became the final judge, and he was the one which became sort of a de facto leader for the whole country. Reading what's on the screen there from 1 Samuel 8, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." Now the first thing you'll notice was the people of Israel blamed Samuel for the problem. Probably good psychology to make sure that if you're going to have a change, you blame somebody else for it. They said to Samuel, "It's your fault. Your sons are not following in the pattern you've set. We don't want to be ruled by someone who's as reprobate as they are. So we're going to ask for a king." But they do at least be honest and they say, "We want one such as all the nations around have." So they're asking to be like the nations that were around them. God said to Samuel, "Look, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me," because it was God who was really leading them, and they should have realised, of course, that if Samuel's sons were not going to do the right thing, then God would select someone who was. But nonetheless, they asked for a king. Samuel explained to them all the things that would happen. They'd have a two-level taxation system. They'd be taxed to support the king and his palace and all his entourage, and the king would take their young men to be soldiers, would take their young men to be chariot drivers and horse looker afterers, and whatever else the king needs, and the young women would be taken to be cooks and seamstresses, and all of these things would happen if they had a king in place. The people still said, "No, we still want a king." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, "We want a king over us, that we'll be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us, to go out before us and to fight our battles." And I think that was the critical thing. They wanted to be like the other nations. But was it so wrong for them to ask? Or were they simply quoting Deuteronomy 17? about 300 odd years earlier, Deuteronomy 17, written by Moses, had said that this is exactly what the people were going to do. We've got it on the screen there. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among the fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. And you can see that not only did this prophesy that that was what they were going to do 300 years in the future, but it even prophesied the motive. In the prophecy it said, you are going to say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around. So were they so wrong? I mean, did they gather to the city of the Levites and listen to the Levites read the law, what we would take as the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah? And when they read Deuteronomy 17, did they all think, well, maybe that's okay? God said you're going to do this. And he even gives conditions. He said, make sure you select a fellow Israelite. So it sounds like it was an okay thing to do. But we'll find out in a moment that I think they misinterpreted that. First of all, just coming back to that phrase, we want to be like all the nations around us. Just a quick quote out of Leviticus 18. This was exactly what God did not want. How many times did he say, do not commit the detestable things that the nations do where I am sending you? I'm going to send you in amongst nations who are committing detestable acts which I hate and which is causing me to drive them out. Reading off the screen, do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I'm going to drive out before you became defiled. I won't bother to read the rest of it, but it just repeats that God was saying to them, do not be like the other nations. Make sure you do not behave in any way that they behave. And yet, they're saying we want a king like the other nations. The first thing they're trying to do is to be exactly the same as the nations around. And Deuteronomy 17 says, 300 year ago prophecy, that's exactly what you're going to do. So all it was saying was it was prophesying, wasn't justifying what they wanted, it was simply prophesying that that is exactly what they were going to do. Another reason they might have wanted a king. If you look back even further back than Moses, back another 200 or 300 or 400 years, back to the time of the patriarchs, in Genesis chapter 49, we get the prophecy that Jacob gave to Judah. He said, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Or how would the people interpret that? I mean, this was Jacob giving a blessing to Judah, saying that the kings will come from you. So pretty obviously the people would have thought it was okay to select a king, so long as that king fitted into the pattern that Deuteronomy 17 had set, that is, he must be one of their own, and he must be one that God chooses. Until Shiloh come, I don't think anybody understands what the word Shiloh means. It's not the city where the tabernacle was. We all know that when the tabernacle came into Israel, it was set up at Shiloh, which was just next to Shechem. But that's not this Shiloh. No one knows what this Shiloh is. We assume it's some title for the Messiah or the selected king, but it's not clear why that word was used. However, so far we can see we've got 2 reasons why the people might have thought it was okay. First of all, Deuteronomy 17 says when you come in, you'll select a king, make sure you obey these rules, and they might have thought that was okay. Genesis 49 also says it was okay. But I think what the people misunderstood, and sometimes I think what we might misunderstand, is that just because there is a prophecy, it does not mean that that prophecy is God's will. It does not mean that's what God wants to happen. It is simply an expression of what will happen. And I'll give you an example. This one's out of Deuteronomy 4. This is an example of a prophecy which is not supposed to tell the people how to act, but tell the people how not to act. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and only a few of you will survive among the nations to which the Lord will drive you. There you will worship man-made gods of wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or eat or smell. There's a classic prophecy which does not represent God's approval, obviously. It's describing what the people were going to do when they had left God and they had deserted him. And when the people look at this, I'm sure they wouldn't think it was a prophecy which was instructing them what to do. But all prophecies have to be interpreted not because they were stated that they represent God's will, but they are simply a prescription of what's going to happen in the future. So when there were two places that said there would be a king, this was not an instruction to get a king. It was simply a prophecy about unfolding future events when the people decided they wanted one. So whether the people misinterpreted it like that, I don't know. But it certainly seems that they decided that being led by God was not what they could trust, because they figured, well, Samuel's sons weren't any good. They didn't realise that God could pick somebody else like Samuel who could lead them. They wanted a king. Another slight diversion here is, why was it that the people were so quick to worship foreign gods? When you find what happened when they went into the land of Israel, they're only there a little time before they started worshipping all of the idols and the false gods that were around them. And have you ever wondered why it was that they departed so quickly? Look at the evidence they had that Yahweh was actually the God that was real and that existed. Even though they couldn't see him, they had no image of him. In fact, they'd been told not to make an image of him. Yet he was abundantly clear in everything that had happened to them. He made bread fall out of heaven. He made water spurt out of a rock. He made a sea stand on its end and divide so that people could walk through. There were so many things that were done by God. Why did they desert and leave him the minute they got into the land? Well, I can't answer it because I wasn't there. However, I think one of the things is that they saw God as the God of warfare. They saw him as the God who was their protector and the God who would bring them into the land. In those days, it was common to have gods for all sorts of different needs. And one of the things that I find curious throughout the whole of the Bible or the Old Testament is how often God is called the Lord of hosts. That word hosts actually, technically it means multitudes, but in context it very rarely does. It normally means armies. So God is calling himself the Lord of armies. And that's exactly how Israel saw him. They saw him as the war god. And that was his allotted duty. So when they prayed to Yahweh, it was to overcome the Ammonites or whoever else they might be fighting, the Moabites or the Edomites. So they prayed to God always when they were in battle. But have a look at their experience with other things beside battle. They'd just come out of the wilderness. They'd been there for 40 years, and in the wilderness down there in Sinai, it doesn't rain. In fact, they ran out of water, had to get water out of a rock, or they'd stop where there was some springs or some area in the desert there where there was some oasis, but there was no rain. They'd just come out of Egypt, where they'd live anywhere between 250 or 400 years. There's a question mark over that. But they'd been in Egypt, no rain. They'd not seen rain for 400 years. I mean, every now and again it rains in Egypt, but basically the Egyptians lived off wells that they sunk beside the Nile, and they lived off the Nile River. Hardly ever rains in Egypt. Suddenly they arrive in Canaan, and all the people bow down in springtime and say, "Please, God Baal, send us rain." and water falls out of the sky. And then you get to autumn, and the people bow down and they say, please God, Baal, send us water. And water falls out of the sky. Regular. And so the people suddenly say, oh, okay, so Yahweh is the God of war because he's beaten all these people on the way through, fought all these battles against the Amalekites and all the rest on our way up to Israel, or up to the land of Canaan as it was then. And yet Baal is the one providing the food, and he's the one providing the rain. And it's worth us thinking that the Israelites are not as stupid as we sometimes give them credit for. They looked at this and they drew the connection that it was Baal that was supplying them with the water. Now, obviously, I'm not justifying it. I'm just giving a reason why they seemed so quickly to depart from the true God. What was the punishment? What did God do to Israel when they deserted him? Well, he sent a drought. He said, you want to pray to Baal for rain? Off you go. And they gave him, in the time of Elijah, 3.5-year drought. In the time of Elisha, a 7-year drought. And droughts were God's common way of punishing the people because they had relied on other gods. And so it always seemed amazing to me why God himself uses the title Lord of Hosts, when in fact he was Lord of everything. Deuteronomy 17 actually gives a list of things that the people had to make sure that the king they selected would obey. He had to be one that God chose. That's okay, they did that. The first 2 kings they had, the first one was Saul. God chose Saul. God spoke to Samuel and said, there's a young man chasing some donkeys he's lost. Go and pick him, break the oil over his head and tell him that he's going to be king over Israel. And so Saul was picked, exactly what this verse says. God picks him, he's a fellow Israelite. Then David was picked. And so successively, each one of them was picked by God, so they're doing that bit right. Make sure that he does not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or get the people to return to Egypt for horses. Don't take too many wives or his heart will be led astray, and he must not accumulate much silver and gold. So these were the conditions. But again, the people failed to realise that these prophecies were not a permission to do these things. These prophecies were simply saying what they would do. And indeed, this is what they did do, but they did turn their back on God, as Samuel said, and they should have waited for God's time. Yes, there was going to be a king, but they should have waited for God's time, and this was a lesson that poor old Jehoshaphat never learned either, if we get up to him. I'm just going to take you through 3 of the kings, actually only 2 of the kings. This is a contrast I've drawn before. I know it's one of my favourite things, so I always talk about it. But I just want to have a look at these particular qualifications given in Deuteronomy 17 and see how they go with Solomon and with Jesus. Remembering Solomon was David's son and Solomon was approved by the people. Jesus was rejected by the people. Have a look at each of these qualifications. First of all, be sure to appoint over you a king that the Lord your God chooses. Right, that's the first condition. For Solomon, I can't think of a passage where God actually says, I've chosen Solomon, but Solomon was obviously approved by God. I've just got 1 Kings 3 here. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. So obviously God was approving of Solomon. God filled the temple with his glory when Solomon built the temple. So certainly God was on side with Solomon. Matthew chapter 3, at that moment heaven was opened and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my Son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. How much more could you want for God to show his delight and appointment of Jesus as the king that he wanted? Go through the rest of the qualifications. Deuteronomy 17 says, the king, moreover, must not acquire a great number of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go that way again. 1 Kings 10, this is what Solomon did. Solomon accumulated chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. So Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Kew. They imported a chariot from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and didn't bother with the horse bit. It is as if Solomon had read Deuteronomy 17 and said, I will break every one of these commands. Solomon has gone to enormous extent to make sure he does exactly the opposite. Not only has he got many horses, but he's gone down to Egypt to get them. Matthew 21. Say to daughter Zion, see, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on a colt the foal of an ass. The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them, and they brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. Only Jesus was the only one to do exactly what Deuteronomy 17 had said. No horses. He didn't even own the donkey. It was a donkey that was borrowed. And here he is fulfilling exactly Deuteronomy 17, whereas Solomon had exactly abused it. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. In 1 Kings 10, verse 27, the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stones, and cedar as plentiful as the sycamore fig trees in the foothills. Silver and gold were as plentiful as whatever you could imagine in Jerusalem in Solomon's time. Solomon imported 666 talents of gold per year. That 666 is the only time 666 is used apart from the one in Revelation that we're all familiar with. Exactly what Deuteronomy 17 had said not to do, Solomon set out to do. What did Jesus do? Matthew 22, show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this? And they said, it's Caesar's. So he said, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. Jesus held no money. Even what was given to him was only food and clothing and shelter. No money at all. And these were the qualifications that the people should have seen in him. He was not to take many wives. This is the next part of Deuteronomy. Or his heart would be led astray. For Solomon, he had 700 wives, 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart away to other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. And then I can't read the rest because of the tiles. Hang on. He followed Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech he followed as well. Again, it's as if Solomon had read Deuteronomy 17 and decided that he will break it as much as he possibly could. I mean, it's just obscene to have 1,000 wives. I cannot even see the purpose of it except just to sort of flaunt your wealth and your grandeur. Somebody once said, I think it might have been me, I don't know, that Solomon would have had to get married every Saturday for 20 years to have 1,000 wives. Can you imagine one of his mates ringing up and say, hey, do you want to go fishing on Saturday, Sol? He says, sorry, getting married again. 1,000 wives? Then you turn to Jesus. Jesus was a virgin and undefiled by women. Now, I've lifted that phrase out of Revelation. It actually applies to the saints. But what Jesus was, I'm not suggesting for a moment that there's anything wrong with us getting married and having a relationship with the opposite sex. But what I'm saying is Jesus gave his total time 100%. Not one part of his life was not devoted to God. And what did they do with the only king that got it right? After every king's example they had, not one of them followed the rules of Deuteronomy 17 except Jesus. And they hung him on a cross. No wonder God was exasperated with them, and that finally brought their destruction on themselves. Okay, that sort of prepares us, I think, now to sort of have a look at King Jehoshaphat. When the kingdom split up, we know that the son of Solomon, Rehoboam, was a selfish king who decided to increase the wealth that Solomon had, and so the people rebelled against him and they separated and they split into two kingdoms. There was the kingdom of Israel on the north, and there was the kingdom of Judah on the south. And the kingdom of Judah was under Rehoboam, and then Rehoboam had a son, I think it was Abijah, and then he had a son, Asa, and Asa had his son Jehoshaphat. So Jehoshaphat had a good start. Asa was a good king. Asa certainly made his mistakes, but Jehoshaphat probably had pretty good instruction. And Jehoshaphat himself turns out to be a good king, except he had one major flaw. And it was tragic. The flaw that he had was such that the nation of Judah never recovered. Just reading from 2 Chronicles 18, now Jehoshaphat had great wealth and honour, and he allied himself with Ahab by marriage. Jehoshaphat was very rich. We'll see in a moment how big his army was. He had great wealth and honour. He was prospering. He was a good king. Everything was working for him. And he decides to align himself with Ahab. Now we all know that Ahab was the most wicked king that Israel had. The Bible gives this testimony of Ahab. It says, as if it was a light thing that he should walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin, he then married Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal of the Sidonians, and introduced Baal worship. At least up until this stage, Israel, they turned their back on Yahweh, but they had built the golden calves at Dan and Bethel, and these two golden calves were very likely a representation of Yahweh. They were not false gods, but Ahab brought in the false god Baal, and that's a difficult thing to define too. The word Baal just means like an owner or a possessor. So it's probably a generic word for a multitude of gods. But that was the sort of the title of Baal, and then there was the goddess Astarte, or whatever her name was, that went with him. This was brought in by Ahab and Jezebel. Their daughter Athaliah was married to Jehoshaphat's daughter Jehoram. And that marriage brought all the sins of Ahab into the southern kingdom, into Judah. So Israel, with all its degeneracy, brought all of their wickedness into Judah, and that wickedness was on and off, but finally caused the people of Judah to fall as well. So poor old Jehoshaphat, as good as he was, actually underwent the process that brought about the final destruction of the southern kingdom. And I'm sort of glad he didn't sort of live to see that, because it must have been terribly, terribly sad to watch that process unfold. Why did he do it? Why did Jehoshaphat marry his son Jehoram to Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel? Well, as you read through this chapter, you begin to see what the motive was. The reason was that Jehoshaphat wanted to reunite the two kingdoms. Jehoshaphat thought, look, we're all the children of Abraham. Why are we separate? Why are we split into two separate kingdoms? Why don't we bring them together? Why don't we unite? Let's all come around the temple. This is where God wants to be worshipped. The temple was built by Solomon for the purpose of worship. That's the fundamental place. Get everybody together. And so he starts to sort of do everything that Ahab wants to try to win him over and to join the two kingdoms. And it was not what God wanted. He obviously hadn't prayed or sought the advice of the prophets. It was going to happen. It was a good thing, but not yet. It was not going to happen till centuries and centuries later. And we remember in Ezekiel 37 how Ezekiel had two sticks, one for Judah and one for Israel. And then even in Ezekiel's time, God said, this will be in the future. Somewhere in the future, these two sticks will be joined together. But Jehoshaphat was just hundreds of years ahead of his time. Did not ask the advice of God, and because of this, he brought destruction on his own kingdom. And when you look at it, you sort of say to yourself, was he right in thinking that he should have brought the people together? And the answer is no, he wasn't. He made the fundamental mistake that the Jews made in Jesus' day. Jehoshaphat thought that a child of Abraham was the bloodline, the lineage. Israel and Judah were children of Abraham. They weren't. They weren't. A child of Abraham does the works of Abraham. And later God was to say to Jehoshaphat, why do you align yourself with evil people? These people have got nothing to do with you. They are wicked. But Jehoshaphat was hung up on the fact that they were all children of Abraham. And he hadn't learned the lesson that John the Baptist and Jesus were to bring out years later, when they said God can raise up off the stones on the side of the road children to Abraham. It means nothing. The lineage means absolutely nothing. But poor old Jehoshaphat didn't know it. So he went and he aligned himself with marriage. Verse 2 here, some years later, he went to see Ahab in Samaria. Do you notice who went to see who? Normally, it's the lesser visits the greater. If your bank manager wants to talk about your house loan, he doesn't come to your house to talk to you. You are invited to come to the bank, to his office. If your boss wants to have a word with you, you go to his office. He doesn't come to your seat or your desk. But here's the reverse. Jehoshaphat is greater than Ahab, but he goes up to see Ahab, placing himself in the lesser position. And Ahab says, can you come and help me get Ramoth in Gilead? I'll just point, I presume that you can see these, but I'm not too sure. There's Ramoth Gilead there. And that's the town that Ahab asked Jehoshaphat to come and help him defend. You'll see all this area up here is Syria. It's all Syria. And this is a border town, and that would be one of the first to fall. I've also got this town here circled, Gibbethon. That's not in our story, but it's on the border of the Philistine territory. All this is Philistines, and Gibbethon is on the border. Both of these towns fell. Both of them fell to the enemy. Why? Well, because they were both, if you look up here, they were both Levite cities. And when Jeroboam created his own priesthood and scrapped the worship of God and had the 2 golden calves, all the priests of the Lord went down south. They all went down to Judah. And these cities became empty. These cities and every other Levite city throughout Israel was emptied of its inhabitants. And what happens to a city that's empty? It gets filled. And so it fell. This one to the Syrians, this one to the Philistines, simply because of the sin of Jeroboam. All the good people, all the people who want to worship God, left and went down south. Ahab, king of Israel, said, would you go with me and fight against Ramoth in Gilead? Why did he ask Jehoshaphat's help? Ahab's army was 7,000 strong. 1 Kings 20 tells you he had an army of 7,000. And there's another place where it says when he went out to fight the king of Assyria, his army, Ahab's army, looked like 2 little flocks of goats on the hills. Jehoshaphat's army, in 2 Chronicles 17, says it was 1.16 million. No wonder Jehoshaphat was asked to help. 7,000 army and a 1.16 million people army. These are not standing armies, by the way. Jehoshaphat did not have an army of 1.16 million, all in uniform, all doing their daily drills. These were just able men. These were just men, I guess, between the age of 18 and 50 or something. But that's how many men could come to the battle. And so that's why he was asked. What's he say? Jehoshaphat replied, I am as you are, my people as your people. We will join you in the war. That was a fundamental mistake on Jehoshaphat's part. He says, I am as you are. No, he wasn't. Jehoshaphat was a worshipper of Yahweh, and he followed all of the rules as best he could in the law. Ahab was a lying cheat. Ahab was a man who was happy to see the death of Naboth so he could get himself another vineyard. And and Ahab was happy to see Jezebel kill the prophets of the Lord. They were not the same. My people are your people, we'll join you in the war. They were not the same. And God was to later say, when all this event was over, God was to say to Jehoshaphat, why do you align yourself with people who are evil? And as I said, the reason was because Jehoshaphat thought they were all children of Abraham. And they weren't. And we can make exactly the same mistakes. The people that we have to align ourselves with are people of the Lord. People who love God. Jehoshaphat says to him, first seek the counsel of the Lord. So the king of Israel brought together the prophets. He brought 400 of them. And he said to them, shall we go to war or not? And they all said, go, because God will give the king in your hand. So that was fine. But there's something weird in this too. Jehoshaphat says to Ahab, can you please get some prophets? And Ahab says, yep, got 400 here. But hadn't Jezebel killed all the prophets of the Lord? In the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel, we're told that Jezebel had killed all the prophets of the Lord. And Obadiah, who was a good man, who was the chief of staff of Ahab, he had hid the prophets of the Lord by 50s in caves and was feeding them. How could they get 400? Hadn't Jezebel killed them all? Well, there's a simple answer, I think. They weren't just prophets of the Lord. They were doing a bit of both. If you wanted a message from Baal, they'd do that. If you want a message from Yahweh, they'd do that. And so they were very likely a mixed group of prophets prophesying for whichever God you like. And that's why they were still available. Then in verse 6, Jehoshaphat asked, is there no longer a prophet of the Lord that we can inquire of? Why does he want another one? He's just had 400. Why does he want 401? Because he knows darn well that these 400 are all corrupt. He knows that they are not real prophets of God. So the king said, no, I won't read that whole verse 7. The king says, yeah, look, there's one more, but I don't like him. He always prophesies bad things about me. And Jehoshaphat says, look, don't say that. Go and get him anyway. So now they've got 401 prophets. So the king says, bring Micaiah, the son of Imlah, at once. So they brought him. Now Zedekiah, the son of Kenaiah, had made iron horns, and he declared, this is what the Lord says, with these you'll gore the Arameans until they are destroyed. And all the other prophets agreed. Everybody said, look, you'll win. You go into battle and you'll win. But finally they're going to have to ask Micaiah, who's the one that Ahab doesn't want to talk to. Okay. Verse 12, they say to Micaiah, look, all the other prophets have said that the king will go and he'll succeed. So why don't you say something good? So Micaiah says, as surely as the Lord lives, I can tell only what my God says. And then he says something really curious. When he arrived, the king asked him, Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth Gilead, or shall I not? And remember, Micaiah has just said, I can only tell you what the Lord my God says. And Micaiah says, attack. In here, attack and be victorious, for they'll be given into your hand. Ahab doesn't believe him. The king said to him, how many times must I make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord? Why didn't he believe him? I think it's pretty obvious, because he was sarcastic in the way he answered him. I can imagine he said to Micaiah, should I go up and do battle? All the other prophets said I should. Micaiah says, yeah, right, off you go. You'll be fine. Go and do your battle, you'll win. And the king could tell straight away that he was being sarcastic. So he says to him, look, tell me the truth. What does the Lord really say? So Micaiah answered, I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd. And the Lord said, these people have no master. Let each go home in peace. The king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, didn't I tell you that he never prophesies anything good about me, but only bad? Okay, so just remember that Jehoshaphat here is a true worshipper of God. He has asked to ignore the 400 prophets who said they'd succeed and bring the one prophet who said no. Not only no, won't you succeed, but the king will be killed. They'll be like, Israel will become like sheep without a shepherd. Everybody will go home to their houses in peace. Their king will be destroyed. So what would you expect Jehoshaphat to do? What would you think he would say? Well, you'd think he'd say, no, look, we've heard the voice of God. Let's call it off. But he doesn't. And that's where I'm finishing, and I'm going to stop my screen there. Because basically, we've just come back to reading some verses. If everybody's got your Bibles open, or your little phone to read off, we just have a look at the verses in 2 Chronicles 18. And I'll pick it up from verse 18. Micaiah tells a strange story. He says, this is the vision I had. I saw God in heaven, and God in heaven said, who will go and lead Ahab to his death when he fights in Ramoth Gilead? And lots of the heavenly spirits came and said different things. One of them came to God and said, I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. And God said, good, you go and do that. So off the spirit goes and puts a lying spirit into the mouth of the prophets of Ahab. 400 lying prophets. Now, I think this is a parable. I don't think God was really sitting up there in heaven and a whole bunch of spirits came by and suggested this. This was like often people see in a vision. They see a parable. And the parable was simply God was saying amongst all of those attendant angels or whatever, we will plan to destroy Ahab because he was such an evil king. Okay, then I'll read from verse 23. Then Zedekiah son of Kenaiah went up and slapped Micaiah in the face. Which way did the Spirit go from you and leave me and go and speak to you? And then King Ahab gets Micaiah and he throws him in jail. So he's been slapped. Zedekiah slaps him. King Ahab puts him in jail. And he feeds him on bread and water and says, feed him on bread and water until I return in peace. And what does Jehoshaphat do? Jehoshaphat knows this is the only prophet of the Lord. Jehoshaphat has just dismissed the other 400. This is the only one who's telling the truth. And Jehoshaphat does nothing. Does absolutely nothing. Doesn't stand up for Micaiah. Doesn't stand up for the word of the Lord. Nothing. And then Ahab says, well, let's go into battle. I won't read the rest of it. I'll just tell you the story. You probably know it already. But Ahab says, look, I've got a really good idea, Jehoshaphat. This is a really good idea. We've just heard a prophecy that the king is going to be killed. So here's my great idea. Why don't I dress up in disguise? I'll just dress like an ordinary soldier and you can wear all the king's clothes. And everybody will think you're the king of the army. Can you see a problem there? Can you see that Jehoshaphat might have said, now hang on a minute. We've just had a prophecy from the Lord that the king is going to be killed. And now you're saying to me, Jehoshaphat, you get dressed up as the king and I'll just pretend to be an ordinary soldier. And what does Jehoshaphat say? He says, yep, okay. Yep, I'm in with that. Everything to placate Ahab. Everything to make sure that he was on Ahab's good side. They went into the battle. Everybody in the Syrian camp had been told to fight with the king, chase down the king of Israel and kill him. And they chased Jehoshaphat thinking he was the king of Israel. But then we're told Jehoshaphat cried out and God saved him. I'm sure he cried to the Lord. He cried to God and he was saved. And then a bowman fired an arrow just at random and it struck Ahab between the joints of his armour, and so Ahab went back and died. And so exactly what happened in the prophecy was that Israel would be scattered. They all went home. Jehoshaphat went home. And to finish the story, what do you think Jehoshaphat would have done? The prophet came to Jehoshaphat and said to him, "You have done wrong. You have aligned yourself with evil people. You should not join with people who are wicked. Doesn't matter whether they're Israelites. Doesn't matter what they are. Do not join with people who are wicked and do not love God." And you'd reckon, it was that plain. It was that plain what the prophet said. And you would reckon Jehoshaphat got the message. Nope, he didn't. Ahab was dead, so he joined with Ahaziah, his son. And he arranged with Ahaziah to get a huge navy to go and get gold from Ophir. And guess what happened? All of those naval ships were destroyed at Ezion-Geber. The whole of them was sunk. By God, by a storm. Poor old Jehoshaphat. He brought on Judah all of Israel's evil. And from that point onward, they went downhill. Yes, they had some good kings. They had Hezekiah and they had Josiah. But they basically went on the downhill trajectory, all because Jehoshaphat aligned himself thinking he was doing the right thing, thinking that he was joining with Ahab to unite the people, to unite Abraham's children. That's it, folks. You can all unmute.